Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you on a Thursday morning and our third podcast in our Advent series. So just to remind us where we're at, I'm going to introduce my guest in just a second. My name is Father Alan Doerksen, and I am privileged to be the vicar of both St. Thomas in Chilliwack and St. Matthew in Abbotsford. And we have been exploring the themes of Advent in the first two podcasts, and we'll continue to do that today. So just to remind ourselves where we've come to, in the first 3 weeks of Advent, the themes have been the coming of Christ, looking ahead to the comings of Christ, if you will, classically as the second time, but also how is it that God keeps coming to us in light of his coming to us in Christ. So the theme is classically rendered as hope for the first week of Advent. Then the second and third weeks, and this is what we covered in last week's podcast, the discussion with Paul Thiessen, which you can still find online, or if you go back to last week's midweek update. Paul Thiessen was able to, in a wonderful way, elucidate the role of John the Baptist as the forerunner and mentor of Jesus. And so we focus on John in the second and third weeks of Advent, and the themes are classically presented as peace and joy. Now, in the fourth week, we turn to Mary. Mary is the ultimate forerunner, if you will, indeed the carrier, the birther of the Christ. And in the great tradition, that has been focused around the theme of love. So that's where we've come to. And this week, to talk about Mary, the role in her own life, but also the role of women in the early church, and how some of all of this is being recovered in the modern period, I turn to my guest, the Reverend Denise Doerksen, who, as you can tell by the last name, just might be related to me. So thank you, Denise, for being here, being part of this podcast. And I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself a little bit about your background, your experience in the church, maybe even what was the role of Mary in your life growing up? Was that highlighted in Advent? All kinds of things you could talk about. And then we'll talk a little bit more also about your life in ministry around the world. So welcome to the St. Thomas, St. Matthew podcast, Denise.
Thank you, Reverend Alan. It's great to be doing this with you and to share this with your parishes. Well, I am also an Anglican priest, and I'm presently without a position, but hope to have a new one sometime in the new year. I grew up, though, in Minnesota. I grew up as a Roman Catholic, and what that meant then was that I grew up in a church that was highly sacramental, and the first thing that you needed to prepare for was First Communion. So as a little girl of 8 years old, I, along with all my other little 8-year-old friends, who were girls anyway, would wear a white veil and a white dress and white gloves and the whole thing, looking like an 8-year-old bride of Christ to begin with. And at that time then a rosary was set in my hands. It was like the first gift that I opened after the receiving my first communion. And from that moment on, then I was taught how to use the rosary. It became a spiritual discipline. And of course, one of the main things that you pray with the rosary is the Hail Mary. And the Hail Mary is something that you would do as a matter of reconciliation after you've made a confession, but also just in prayer when you're wanting to be comforted or you need some guidance, you would say the Hail Mary. So yeah, the role of Mary, or really actually Mary was somebody that I related to along with God, along with Christ, or as a saint, she was an intermediary, a friend really, and a female friend at that.
Can I ask a question about that? What was that like to involve Mary in your prayers, but only experience men as the leaders in your parish? Or were there women who were also leading, maybe not in priestly ways, but in other ways?
Yeah, yeah. The parish that I was a part of was called St. Timothy's, and the church was on a huge site in which there was also a convent. So there was I learned right from childhood the separation of roles between the men and the women. The women, I mean, they were both. I mean, one was a real private role. That would be the nuns. They had a convent. They did the catechism classes, which I would attend. They wore habits. They had a uniform, and then the men were, the male clergy were always seen in public, right? They were the ones who were officiating, and so as a part of my childhood and of spiritual maturation, it was established that women were in the private sphere or taught children, and the men were in the public sphere.
Interesting. Okay. So then you grew up within this milieu in Minnesota, and you went on from your teenage years to work in ministry, and that whole story of how you came to that, or what you all experienced spiritually. I mean, you can share if you want, but I'm interested in particular with what you ended up doing, the roles you ended up playing. I think there was New York, and then there was the Middle East, and how did that factor into you being called to ministry?
Sure. Yeah. Well, in many ways, I think because of such a dichotomy between the men and the women and what they did in relationship to ministry in the church, I wanted to poke at it. I wanted to adventure out a little bit, and also I think really just seeing what life is like in being a woman and relating to other people, or seeing my mother in particular being a good Catholic woman who made sure that she had a big family and all this. It was hard. So there was a lot of suffering and a lot of difficulties. And so I guess kind of wanted to lean in that direction and serve women more. And so, yeah, then I went, and because I couldn't become a public figure, become ordained in the Catholic Church, then the best venues for ministry would be like parachurch sort of things. So going to New York, I worked with women in a drug rehab center in Brooklyn, and also lived in a flat in Brooklyn in which me and my roommate Kathy would take in women who were struggling on the street, women who wanted to get off of cocaine, or even just to kind of have a good warm meal. And so I really got to know what life was like for a lot of women who were prostitutes and who were struggling with substance abuses and so on. And then, yeah, I ended up also living in Bethlehem and having a flat there, and working with a couple who had a friendship center for men. And I was asked to come and to develop a friendship center for women, particularly Palestinian women. So I just so really enjoyed that work of going to the campus of University of Bethlehem and walking around and just getting to know and meet some Arab women, some Muslim women, Christian Arabs as well, and then having them over for tea in my flat and hearing about their lives and their stories, in order to befriend them and to show them the face of God.
Yeah, and that's sort of where we ended up meeting and developing a relationship. And again, story for another day. Um, but long and short of it is you ended up in Anglican ministry, and part of the reason we ended up in the Anglican Church was because of your call to leadership, and also um, the sacramental nature of the Anglican Church, or the potential sacramental nature of the Anglican Church, allows it to marry in some ways the best of the great Catholic tradition with emerging insights into the role of women in the early church, but also in modern society. Um, yeah, not that that's always been an easy fit for either of us, but it has allowed for that.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how we end up in this place. So I had asked Reverend Denise, as I call her, I don't call her Reverend Denise at home, to reflect on the role of Mary. And so we're just going to kind of launch into some free-flowing discussion, hopefully, around the role of Mary in our faith, in the Gospel of Luke, and things that we can learn and apply to our life in this world, which of course is still undergoing mammoth shifts in relationship to I would say underlying it is probably the role of the Christian gospel, of God moving in our society to bring us to places of greater justice and equality, and relating to people from different cultures and different ways of looking at the world. So that's still unfolding 2,000 years after Gabriel appeared to Mary. And we can talk a little bit about that. So we know that in year C of the lectionary, we're in the Gospel of Luke. And though we read the birth story of Jesus from Luke most Christmases, and we read a little bit about Mary in each Advent season, Luke in particular focuses or has a special emphasis on Mary. There's her reaction and acceptance of her calling. There's her interaction with Elizabeth and what Elizabeth says to her about her being the most blessed of all women, and all the future generations will call her that. Yeah, there's Mary's interactions with the angels and the shepherds and with Joseph. And although we don't really hear the conversation, would be fun to have had some insight into the conversations Joseph and Mary had. So just wanting us to reflect a little bit about on all of that. Segue maybe into Luke's treatment of women throughout his gospel. He does focus a lot on women and Jesus's interaction with women, and maybe that has something to do with Mary. But anyway, what are some of your thoughts on that? And yeah,
Sure.
take it
Yeah.
away.
Yeah. Well, I think that over the years, I've increasingly thought that Luke must have had some very courageous, strong women in his life, a wife or a mother or aunt or grandmother, whatever, just some, maybe many women, I don't know, who really opened his eyes to what life is like in being a woman, and particularly there in the land where the Romans are oppressing and making life hard. And, I think, as we know, increasingly know, with materials that are put out there by feminist theologians and writers who are secular as well, that those who are most typically can be most affected by oppression and by poverty are women, and women with children, right? So yeah, Luke just seems to have been an ally of women, and I see that especially in the very beginning of his gospel, because you know, how is it or why is it that Mary, I mean, we know that Mary, was visited by the angel and became the mother of God, Theotokos, um, but but how Luke presents her and the voice and the words that he gives her in the story of the Gospels, I think is vital to understanding the rest of Luke, um, and vital in the sense that it's male and female that are revealing this new work of God, Emmanuel, come to
Yeah,
us.
yeah. Okay, so let's hold on to a couple things there. I want you to talk a little bit about Theotokos and what that means, Mother of God. I mean, you couldn't have probably a more exalted title in the history of humanity, and it's kind of like, does it even make sense? I'd love to chat with you about that. But you're onto something, I think, with the allyship, because Luke is writing 40 years, 30, 40 years after the events, right? So, and he says that he's parsed out all of these sources. And, typically in the ancient world, the male source would have been considered the authoritative source.
Mhm.
And yet Luke does all that he can to involve Mary, because I mean, just the intimacy of her thoughts that's revealed in the first chapters would suggest that Luke has had either in-depth conversations with Mary herself or with people who knew her extremely well, or he has access to some written source of her poetry, if she learned how to write or if she was literate. And he makes a deliberate choice, like decades after. So he's not just doing verbatim journalism here. He's crafting a message. He's crafting an interpretation of Jesus, and he relies on Mary, and he fronts the role of women in his gospel.
Mhm.
So I think that is so fascinating. And I wonder, I mean, it's one thing for us to say in our time, he had a strong woman or women in his life, but it almost seems revolutionary for him to be doing that at the time, unless, of course, he is just taking those parts of the scripture that do rely on testimony about the strong role of women and the important role of women from Eve on down, including Moses's mother, right, who hid him in the bulrushes. And there's got to be Hannah. We all have all of these role models, even from the Hebrew scriptures, of women. Sarah, Hagar. Yeah, there's many we could talk about,
Yeah.
right?
Well, see, the thing that really strikes me is that uh, Mary is presented, but before she becomes a mother,
Yeah.
we hear her speaking. And so different from Hannah, different from Sarah. We know them because they, as mothers. I mean, we do hear a little bit of, like, well, I won't go into those kinds of stories, but
Mhm.
but as you were talking, I was actually kind of thinking, what if Luke had a daughter who said, Daddy, you have to make sure that you convey to people who Mary was as a young woman, and who
Mhm.
she was in relationship to God, in the story she knew about God, and her hopes and her passions, and like, put that in there, before she became this mother of God. And you don't even kind of see that play out in Luke's gospel. It's that
Yeah.
we see and hear the voice of the tradition, the Christian tradition, particularly the Catholic one. It can even influence the Protestant, right?
Mhm.
Particularly with the Theotokos, the icons in which Mary is holding a small baby Jesus. But that is so not the whole of, it's not the whole of who Mary was. She was a person who was in relationship to God, and was seeking liberation for her people.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, and, like, I mean, and I guess if you really want to go with the mother, imagery, even that can be twisted, or we can be just thinking that mothers are docile and loving and caring, and yes, they can be, some are not, but also they're so feisty and courageous and like mama bears. If you get between a mama bear and her cub, watch out, right? So
Mhm.
because she wants to protect. So there's those elements that don't often really come out, but like in the tradition, but they sure come out, I think, in the Magnificat, right? That's a pretty potent
Mm.
revolutionary um, prophecy and song.
Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. Uh, well, where would we begin? The yeah, the I guess maybe to talk about it is to say that I've seen it in a new light because of some of the things that I've been reading, in which um, feminist theologians in different places in the world, uh, like particularly those countries where the Spanish conquistadors came in and destroyed cultures and brought in their version of the Catholic Church, which included Mariology, included a particular depiction of Mary, which was supposed to fit for all women, right? And so,
And what was that picture? What was the picture they brought in?
yeah, that picture would be that the docile, submissive, second-class citizenship, where the men were to rule and to dictate how life was to be for women, for all women, right? Um, because of their understanding of Mary as that person who just says, yes, yes, sir, yes, sir,
Mhm.
right? Um, but the feminist theologians in Argentina and Colombia and the Philippines, um, they resonate with the Magnificat, which is all about wanting liberation, wanting to see that the nurturing idea of motherhood actually expands, or people expand their understanding of it to one who is going to march through the streets and say, we want our disappeared children to be found in Mexico, or
Mhm.
I mean, even indigenous women and peoples in our country of Canada, like
Mhm.
it can tend to be the women who are the forerunners for liberation, for justice, for wake up, take notice. But Spanish conquistadors are all about, oh no, we're going to do what we want to do. We're going to destroy. We're going to establish what we want, and we're not going to necessarily listen to the voice of women who are saying, hang on, wait a minute, what about flourishing for everyone and life
Mhm.
for everyone that is just and equal, men and women, but also the Spanish and the indigenous peoples.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're talking about how the overall, in some ways, it sounds like, and we can talk about how the Catholics did this and how the Protestants did this, and maybe the cultures they are allied with, or the nationalities they're allied with, how they subverted the radical nature of Mary in the gospel,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in order to build a patriarchal structure in society and church. Um, and, I mean, in the Catholic tradition, is it fair to say that that was kind of the ever virgin, right? Like she was the pure, holy, ever virgin, not tainted by sexuality or anything quote unquote indecent. And in the Protestant tradition, especially with under the influence of Calvinism, it was she just said yes. She had really no choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
This was irresistible grace that was coming to Mary, and she was simply the vessel through whom God decided to give us Jesus.
Yeah.
Just kind of like a tube.
Yeah.
And of course, some people have pointed out that this smacks of stories from Greek mythology, in which Zeus and Jupiter and all these gods would just come down and ravish a woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basically rape a woman.
Mhm.
And you have God doing that sort of thing. No say in Mary. At
Mhm.
least the Catholic tradition has this strong role for a say for Mary.
Yeah.
Her yes matters, her free will matters. But in the Protestant tradition, that's actually been completely done away with. And so
Mhm.
Mary becomes this simple cipher that you can pour whatever you want to
Well, and
into.
worse, at its worst, it is a form of violence, which
Yes,
we see continues to play out all over, even in what we call the developed world. Women don't have a say over what they do with their lives and with their bodies and so on.
right.
It's yeah.
So to flip this and to get back to these women that you were talking about from the 2/3 world, um, it would actually seem in Luke's gospel that God gives a woman the ultimate say of how salvation will unfold.
Hmm.
And in the great tradition, we have this understanding that she's kind of reversing, God's giving her the opportunity to reverse the primal myth, if you will, that Eve said yes to the tempter. However, whatever we want to do with that story with Adam and Eve, it seems like in Luke's gospel, there's such a strong position for Mary to be in. Do you want to say, and maybe that relates to what some of these women are saying?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I have been thinking in preparation for chatting with you is that um, I think that Mary uh, could perhaps have been this person who was uh, so justice oriented, so reading the stories of the Old Testament from Eve to Moses, and is joining in the refrain of let God come and fulfill your promises, and her saying that in her heart and in her life, and
Mm-hmm.
how she lived and how she prayed, so much so that God sees her and says, whoa, she's the vessel.
Ah,
She's cooperating. She's saying yes before we hear her saying yes to the
right,
angel,
right,
right?
right,
I,
right.
I think that's possible. Yeah.
Well, she's already a part of the faith, right?
Huh.
Like we forget that, like to the Jewish, Gentiles were grafted in to the faith, but the faith is already there for Israelites. They're
Yeah.
already part of the chosen. She's not chosen kind of abstractly outside of the already chosen.
Yeah.
She's inside the family.
Well, and she's saying, I I'm inside, but I am also I don't know that she's determining this, but Luke
Yeah.
is saying it for her, that um I am out there with a rallying flag too. And she didn't have any inhibition about being able to do that. Just like we can see in women who are, marching through in parades and and like I said, in Mexico and other countries where children have disappeared, and well, even in Palestine
Mm,
today, right? It's like the women are out there and uninhibited and saying, no, this something has to happen. The troubles and the suffering is too much. God must be there. We're going to hope, and we can do it. And even if we're going to be, despised by the powers that be they male primarily or male and female, whatever. It's just like
mhm, mhm.
they're out there. And so Mary isn't just this little, pure, untainted, quiet little, um, young teenager. I see her as she's been marching. She wants to continue to do so. And then she lives that out after she gives birth to Jesus,
Hmm. Yeah.
raising him and nurturing him in this milieu of God come, and believing that God has come through this baby, this toddler, this young man that she is mentoring and loving, to become um, the one who fills the Gospel of Luke with stories of looking after or seeking to raise up men and women, and lots of women. And Luke is, making sure we know how many, and puts it out there. It's awesome.
Yeah. So given what you've just said, which I tend to agree with actually, that there's a synergy, if you will. God, God's choosing is isn't just willy-nilly, nor is it something we earn, but
Mhm.
there's a kind of divine mystery as to why somebody like, say, Paul the Apostle was chosen, or somebody like Mary is chosen, or Moses, or whatever. And we can't figure all of that out except to say that it is a partnership and there's a synergy of grace, if you will.
Mhm.
Um, so given that, what you've just said, then it kind of makes sense. Maybe you could correct me, um, to say that Mary had an active mentoring role in Jesus's life. And maybe one of the reasons that he was able to have so many women followers and be so radical in this respect, to be have men and women as important followers and early apostles, is because of his relationship with Mary. I mean, we're not sure if basically Jesus wasn't raised by a single mother, right? Like, we don't know when Joseph died. There's some evidence in the tradition that he died, that he trained Jesus as a carpenter, but that he wasn't around at the time of some of the most formative, maybe ministry starting events of Jesus's life. I don't know, just come back at me there. Like, what do you think Mary's role would be given what you said?
Yeah.
Or can we know?
Well, I mean, right from the beginning, going back to the Magnificat, it's very likely that that was the first song that Jesus heard in utero, right? As we know, singing and talking to a baby
That's
growing
cool.
in the
I
womb.
like that.
Yeah, it's like this is the first song, and what a song! What a rallying cry
Hmm.
for yeah, for liberation, for people, for all peoples, right? The down and out and the marginalized and the weird ones and the ones that God is meant to remember, not forget. So she's saying this to him while he's growing inside, and no doubt she would have continued to say these things and more, and fill it out more as he grew in the ability to understand. Him sitting on her lap as a toddler, learning the stories of the Old Testament, and learning and seeing as boys and girls do in as toddlers, from their mother as they go around the village and they are in relationship to others, and feeling the angsts, and feeling the feeling and experiencing the suffering that's about. Mom takes Jesus around to experience all these things, right? So
Mhm.
it's Mary is in what in relationship with Jesus as a mother, but also uh, as a community builder, or one who opens Jesus's eyes to the community and to God. So yeah, and then he grows to be a teenager and a young adult, and the role begins to shift. He's uh, he knows more. He's probably getting instruction, or we think that from what the Christian tradition says, he's getting some instruction from rabbis sitting at their feet, but then also perhaps teaching them something, right? And I would think that that has to do with Mary's spirit and feistiness. Like, I got something to say. Jesus is like, I got something to say. Yeah, he is the Son of God. He is the incarnation of God. But nonetheless, he's coming into his own, and he's learning.
He's truly human, right? He's truly human. So there
Yeah,
has to be that divine mystery.
yeah, yeah. Well, and then it between Mary and Jesus, uh, there is a significant change in the relationship, where they're friends and they're on par, probably, with theology and ideas about life and so on, whatever, everything, to then where he becomes her mentor, or he
Mm,
mentors her, and she's his disciple. Um,
mm.
she's his disciple, and because certainly there's a point, or maybe it's there's many points, where Jesus is opening Mary's eyes to who he is.
Mm,
And she continues to be open to that. She
mm,
continues to grow theologically and spiritually, so
mhm.
much so that she doesn't abandon him at the cross, right? It's not as though, I don't think that Mary is there primarily because she's his mother, but primarily because
Mm.
um, she believes in who he is, and she believes throughout that whole horrible endeavor, right? Um, and
Yeah.
wants to continue to be open to what God is revealing. That's just amazing. Yeah.
So that's really cool. Let's talk about that a little bit then. In relationship to God, what does Mary, um, how does Mary help us to challenge traditional images of God?
Mm,
Um, does
mm,
she fill those out for us? And I mean, the tradition in the year 430 at the Great Council of Ephesus, one of the great seven ecumenical councils, decided to call her Theotokos, not just as the Nestorians wanted, Mother of Christ, but Mother of God.
mm,
And that was a turning point, I think, in our relationship to understanding this divine synergy.
mm.
Um, Something that I think, unfortunately, the Protestant Reformation never really wrestled with enough because they were so trying to overturn some of the abuses of the powerful medieval church, rightly so, I think, that they kind of left aside this idea of divine union and even divine partnership in bringing about the divine presence in the world, that God is so courtly and um, gentle, but also partnership oriented with this image that God has created, that she is purposefully holding back any kind of you know uh, assertion, if you will. But the Theotokos tells us that this is such a partnership, more profound than we know.
Yeah.
So what in your mind is Mary, but also now we can segue into like feminist theology or things that you've been reading that have challenged some of your or the images traditionally of God.
Yeah. Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, Theotokos, Mother of God, is um, it almost is a title for Mary, which plays at the edges of considering God as female, God as a mother, rather than, or not rather, but also mother and father, right? So
Mhm.
um, Mary, of course, is not God's, like, uh, the God who
Yeah, she's created being, right? Just like we're
yeah,
all created beings. Yeah.
thoroughly created. Thank you. Right. Yeah. And so she's not infinite and she's not eternal, um, but she reveals in who she is, and the stories that we hear in the Gospels, that God is mother, and then, like you were saying, though, mother in that always bringing life,
Mm.
nurturing, protecting, guarding, keeping, um, reconciling, liberating, vivifying, all these things that are
Birthing, growing,
birthing.
incubating, all of
Yeah.
that, right?
Well, yes, birthing, delivering, going through what is laborious and hard in order
Ah,
to see uh, good things come of it. And I mean, in a really small metaphorical way, that's what she did in burying Jesus, right? But huge, and it became huge. The thing the whole of creation longed for, right?
hmm.
And to her surprise, most likely too. I mean, faith becomes surprising. Like Mary, the Mother of God, is has revealed to us and continues to reveal to us what it is to be always open to the surprise of God working in us, always being expectant. Um, I mean, men and women, people of all sexual orientations and stratas in life, uh, are meant to be like Mary, the Mother of God, in or or can be expectant, can through their suffering and through what they are hoping for, keep pressing God to be revealed, to surprise them and to surprise the world in what they can do, what they can become, or what they can give and birth.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're saying that it's not overturning um, all of the male images of God that we have. I mean, we could talk about how we like absolutely need to go beyond any kind of sexuality in God. God is beyond creation and is infinite and eternal and all of that kind of stuff. But that we, made in the image of God, need to now incorporate all kinds of different, like that's something that goes across the continuum of gender,
Yeah.
if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how has this affected your relationship with God, and your prayer and your understanding of God? Somewhat similar to what you've just said, or is there something more you'd want to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would add that because I have, gotten to know women and ministered to women, I am a woman. Um, I feel like I've grown in an awareness of a multi-ethnic, multi-faith community of women in the world, today, but in the world of, a century ago, even through the books that I've read, through the feminist theologians that I've read, which have really opened my eyes to um, of how they look at God, through the lens of um, well, as one Argentinian feminist theologian writes, through the lens, we can look at God um, through the lens of decency or indecency. You were mentioning that a little bit before, right? Or alluding to it. And there's a woman named Marcella Alfaus Reed who talks about this. And she's describing it might be slightly heady, but it will help get to what you're asking about, how my perception of God has changed, right? And so she writes about a system of decency, which is that it is a sexual, social, political, economic, and theological system that shapes the entire way of thinking and acting in relation to ourselves, each other, and the natural world. So decency really then is the manifestation of a heterosexual matrix. So many people fall outside of this. Many of the women that I have met and known in New York and Palestine and all over the place, many fall outside of this. Being single mothers, well, that's not so decent. Being divorced woman, that's not so decent. Queer people, prostitutes, women who have abortions, women who are too independent. And you can put in a bunch of other, outside of what seems to be decent, right? And if you do this, you're thinking in a way that fortifies a theology that oppresses women and even gives, allows for violence, allows for subjugation, right? And even more, though, it refuses to listen to them speak as persons, not just women, but persons, called with all persons to a better way of being in relation to everything, right? And so indecent theology is about finding new models of community and friendship outside the limits of this system that is good for everyone. So that leads to then that God is a queer God. he's indecent sounds horrible to say, but it's like this is the God that Mary is reflecting in the Magnificat, right? And Luke is conveying all the stories that he brings out in his gospel.
Right.
It's so amazing. So many of the people are beyond the pale. They're not, but Jesus wants to raise them up and comes to them and heals them. And many of them are women who are not within the matrix that we think is what God's concerned about. God is concerned about it and draws all of these different kinds of people within herself.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really good. Thank you, Reverend Denise. And it's great to think that we have this opportunity as Anglicans to experience not just a season where we're looking ahead to Christ's birth, as many churches do. So just kind of this punctiliar event at Christmas and then it's over, right? Except for the gifts you got to bring back because you never really wanted them. But in the great tradition, we have this season where we look at these forerunners and we're able, especially with Mary, there was a little bit about this with John last week, and Paul brought this up, that John is on the outskirts of things. He's not part of institutional life, and he's challenging the institutions really to change. And of course, Mary is that way as well. She's outside of at least the way the church has domesticated her over the millennia. And she calls us in Advent to a new experience of the divine, a richer understanding of her fiat mihi, which is the yes, let it be to me according to your word. This is not servile. This is a fully fledged, engaged human being interacting with the divine spirit in the most surprising and momentous of ways, changing everything. And that's what we get to appreciate in the fourth week of Advent as we prepare for the coming of the Christ, and as we look for how in men and women, in all people across the gender continuum, God continues to come, continues to form Christ in the world, in and through our words and actions, in and through our hope and peace, peaceful actions, our joyful anticipation of good things yet to come, and of course, ultimately in the love we give to each other and to the world. So I want to thank you so much for participating in this, and
thank you.
Look forward to seeing you later.
Yeah. Well, great.
God bless.
Bless you. Bye-bye.
See you for now.
Yep.
I have to stop this recording though first.